I'm talking about 2003 or 79? And 79, of course, was a different thing entirely. No, I was talking that...
I thought that you were talking about the 1979
No, I was referring to 2003.
The 2003 visit is, of course, once again a major, a watershed, a major turning point. Rajamon, trying to, this entire 1962 and what came out in 1970 was possibly this offer which Chow En-lai made to Brijesh Mishra, I think, at some point, that some kind of signals were said. That is what various accounts do mention. Basically, by and large, that whether a particular incident happened or not is really not important, but we have also discussed in the program that by the 70s, the Chinese were also willing to look at different means as to how to re-engage with India. Now, how did this process happen and why?
I think before I come to that, I just wanted to say a word about 62.
Sure.
I mean, if you look at it objectively, what actually happened on the ground, if you are not an Indian and not a Chinese...
there aren't very many objective views on it.
No, I'm saying if you take detached view of that, I mean, to dignify it with war, a term war might be too much. I mean, there were a series of skirmishes and some battles. The tragedy was in India's mind because India had sentimentally constructed...
Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai?
Yeah, I mean, that's just the expression of it.
Yeah,
but the image that and the objectives that India had set for itself and the notion that it constructed about China was so fundamentally unreal. So it was the shattering of your illusions that as a war, as a specific act, okay, I mean, it was there. Now, but the fact is, other countries have dealt with far more severe consequences. For example, if you take the Korean War, 1950 to 53, the Americans and Chinese killed each other in very large numbers. Now, 20 years later, Mao Zedong was ally of Nixon, and despite the fact that his own son was killed in the Korean War. So, rather than see it in power terms, I mean, our whole construction of China was an emotional one. And once that shattered, the reaction, the backlash to it, say, look, now we won't do anything. From saying, we're going to change the world.
It became a very emotional kind of...
So it was our problem. It was our mental problem. It is not that it was such a terrible event that, that you had to forever be humiliated.
And if I may add here, the outcome of that emotional shock was that you have a parliamentary resolution which is unbelievably, again, sentimental. Not an inch of the motherland shall be, given up.
And no one would be willing to have a relook at it.
Well, I think Parliament is sovereign. They can always do what they wish to.
Do another resolution.
They can always, but the emotionalism that is invested in this shock.
So I think that there is a deeper problem, I think, for India-China, which is that the attempt at constructing grandiose objectives. I mean, if you go back to the interaction between India and China, I mean, the first one was in the late 20s, in the Brussels Anti-Imperial Congress. Then you had the bye-bye phase. Right now to BRICS, and we're going to change the world. We're going to construct an alternative world. But at each point, the rhetoric of cooperation ran into realities on the ground, which fundamentally made it difficult to cooperate. For example, if we're both anti-colonial, both were anti-imperialist.
Right.
But the Second World War put us on the opposite sides. We said we want to fight the British. Chinese were fighting the Japanese. Right. And Gandhi was not willing to offer much cooperation. So therefore, for all the talk about anti-imperialism, the Second World War, you were actually not, unable to cooperate. Similarly, in the Cold War, both of us said, look, we are Asian brothers, blah, blah, blah. But then they aligned with the Americans. We aligned with the Soviet Union. So there again, you caught how the regional power politics played.
Even in 1971, for instance.
Absolutely. I mean, that of course was deeper in what they did with Pakistan. But today again, I think again you're constructing an illusion, which is, look, there is this grand bargain we're going to do with the Chinese. But the reality on the ground is far more complicated. But I think the challenge is 62 lesson must be, look, we got to be realistic.
Right.
We got to understand China as a power, rather than this anti-imperial, idealist construction of relationship with China. As long as we don't do that, we're going to be in for shocks again and again.
Right. May I just add to this? I mean, very briefly, I know we have a shortage of time. I think there has been, in a sense, I agree with what Raj has been saying. There was a certain naivety in our approach in the 50s towards China. I don't want to dwell at it in great length, but there's also an element, I think, of not understanding how power politics plays itself out. Not understanding what the Chinese psyche is and how China views the world. So we had this own utopian world which we had created. And I think you have to ask yourself the question, who was responsible for that? So when the shock came, and I would not underplay the implications and the importance of the 1962 attack. I mean, if you don't want to call it a war, that's your choice. But I think it was certainly a very major attack on India. I mean, you can always argue that it was good for India in many ways. We then were forced to look at an area of our defense preparedness which we had ignored so far. And it made you more realistic about how the world works. But I think you have to acknowledge that mistakes were made, and mistakes were made partly because perhaps we were too naive in our understanding of how the world works. But I'd also like to use this opportunity to tell our viewers that there is in public domain virtually the entire literature on what happened between India and China from the early 50s till 1965. It's in the white papers presented to Parliament. So there is no dearth of information on what happened.
And
those white papers are pretty authentic, yes, because it's not just the Indian responses, but also what the Chinese said. So if you are a serious scholar or researcher or interested, all this information is in the public domain. The irony is, and perhaps the tragedy is, that most people don't bother to read this material.
What about in the 70s, when we're talking about the ambassador level, the decision to set up ambassadors in the two countries? Now, that was also preceded by a certain amount of change in the Chinese psyche you were talking about earlier. I would like to dwell on it a bit more.
You see, I think the Chinese, irrespective of the fact that the Cultural Revolution was then underway, the Chinese were realistic enough to understand what 1971 meant in terms of power equations in Asia. By 1976, I think when Mrs. Gandhi decided that ambassador, and that process took a long time in India, that we would send our ambassador back for some of the reasons which I think both Alka and Raja have referred to. By the time in 1976, the Cultural Revolution was beginning to wane. You had very distinct signs that the Chinese now wanted to go back to a sense of normalcy. And they were also vulnerable. And I think talking to India would help them reduce the sense of vulnerability, which could actually become a real problem for them. Suppose India had decided to ally itself, for instance, with somebody else. The Chinese understand this very well. They play the game of power politics very well. So why not neutralize your flank? And if you are really going to now begin to normalize your internal situation, then you must first begin to normalize with your major neighbors.
Alka, domestically, in regard to India's first non-Congress foreign minister, that is Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in the Janata, two major achievements are always listed, primarily from the political supporters of Mr. Vajpayee. One is that going and addressing the United Nations in Hindi, and the second is the China visit. Being projected as some kind of an achievement of the Jansangh section of the Janata Party at that time. Now, in the context of the visit to China, to what extent was it an initiative of the foreign minister, or was it a natural progression of development since the 70s, what we have been talking about?
And the 79 visit.
Yeah, the 79 visit as a foreign minister.
Yeah, I know. I see it as a progression because it is right from the early 70s onwards. We, starting the famous Mao's signal to Brajesh Mishra, then Indian overtures, then in Mrs. Gandhi's statement in the Lok Sabha and to journalists that it's pointless to just stand at one place and not move. We need to move on. And finally, you have the meetings on the sidelines of various various other global kind of meetings, and there you go. So Vajpayee's visit comes about. And that then quickly triggers off return visits, because 1981 we have the Chinese foreign minister
the momentum
coming.
is never given up and then leads up to...
So it's not very well known, but it has been a continuous interaction, meeting, overtures, invitations, and that has led. So in a sense, what is heartening is that the 70s were not a standstill kind of a phase, and which is why the 80s... but two points which came out of the earlier thing which I would like to bring up. One is regarding this, when Mr. Suri mentioned about the naivety. I don't know whether I'd like to use that word, because I do not like to subscribe to the view that Nehru was this great romantic visionary. I think there was a very strong realistic streak in him. He was aware of the China-India competition and challenge. He refers to it in many on many occasions. But he had, I mean, you can say that there were both aspects in him. He did conceptualize a visionary, idealistic
and he was
kind
also
of,
romantic.
but he was also, so there is this duality. And as far as public domain is concerned, you mentioned that what is the perception? The white papers are there, but we don't surely expect the
people to actually go and look at the white papers.
And in addition to the white papers, there is a whole lot of aspects about this interaction which are still not made public. The very famous Brooks-Henderson report, which actually went into so in a sense,
there is a fair amount of material which is there in the public domain, but a lot more, like various other things, can
that's
also come
what
out.
is available in the public domain is the tip of the iceberg, I would submit.
We'll take another break and then come back and resume this conversation.
Mr. Suri will agree with me.
In the 25 years since Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, the journey of Sino-Indian ties has gone past many significant milestones. Be with us. We'll be back after a break, and we'll talk about some of these.
इस घर में हर पल हो खुशियों की दिवाली, आने वाली जो भी हो नन्ही सी एक जान है आने वाली। ध्यान रहे प्रसव होने तक देख रेख हो पूरी, सही समय पे टीके गोली लेना है जरूरी। जच्चा बच्चा की सुरक्षा परिवार के हाथ, इस घर में हर पल हो खुशियों की दिवाली। सुन लो बात फतेह की हमने देखी,
जननी सुरक्षा योजना में पंजीकरण कराएं, सुरक्षित प्रसव और आर्थिक सहायता दोनों पाएं।
श्यामू, देखो फिर आ रहा है, नया टीवी मांगेगा। मैं निकलता हूँ, तू टाल दियो।
जरा रुकिए।
हाँ बोलिए।
ये देखिए कंज्यूमर कोर्ट का फैसला।
ये कागज किसी और को दिखाना, इससे कुछ नहीं होगा।
अब जरूर होगा। अदालत का आदेश ना मानने पर तुम्हारे खिलाफ वारंट जारी हो सकता है।
तो क्या?
तो तुम्हें 3 वर्ष तक का कारावास या 10,000 रुपए तक का जुर्माना या दोनों हो सकते हैं। समझे?
समझ गया।
जागो ग्राहक जागो।
लो आई तारा की मम्मी। सरपंच ने पूछा,
आज खाने में क्या बना? चावल, चना और हरी सब्जी। वहाँ है।
सरपंच ने दिया ध्यान, सरपंच ने दिया ध्यान, तो बने इतने पौष्टिक पकवान।
मम्मी, अम्मा, अम्मी, हमको कितना अच्छा खाना मिलता है ना।
बच्चों का अधिकार है शिक्षा और पौष्टिक आहार जो दे चुस्ती खेल कूद और पढ़ाई के लिए। मिलकर करें इनका पढ़ना पक्का।
मिड डे मील योजना का लाभ देश के 11 करोड़ से भी अधिक बच्चे पाते हैं।
मुझे पैसों की बहुत जरूरत है। इस गोल्ड ज्वेलरी के कितने पैसे मिल जाएंगे?
बहन जी, ये तो सब पीतल है।
What? अब मैं क्या करूं? अब मैं अपने बेटे का एडमिशन कैसे कराऊंगी?
अगर आपने सोने की ज्वेलरी खरीदते समय उस पर हॉलमार्क के 5 निशान देखे होते तो आज यूं निराश न होना पड़ता।
हॉलमार्क का निशान, शुद्धता की पहचान।
जागो ग्राहक जागो।
मेरी गल्फ में नौकरी लग गई सर। है सर?
हाँ भाई, ये आपका पासपोर्ट, इमिग्रेशन क्लियरेंस, वर्क वीजा, एम्प्लॉयमेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्ट और प्रवासी भारतीय बीमा योजना।
बीमा योजना?
इस योजना के तहत बीमार पड़ने पर 50,000 का खर्चा, अपना कोई केस लड़ने के लिए 25,000 की मदद और मृत्यु पर 10 लाख का भुगतान।
सब सही है ना सर?
मुझ पर भरोसा रखिए, मैं एक रजिस्टर्ड एजेंट हूँ। कोई भी प्रॉब्लम हो, ये रहा मेरा नंबर। आपकी पूरी जिम्मेदारी मेरी है, यहाँ भी और वहाँ भी।
प्रवासी भारतीय कार्य मंत्रालय का टोल फ्री नंबर 1800113090।
क्यों? भूख लगी है।
साबुन से हाथ धुलेंगे तो
सेहत रहेगी। दाल की खुशबू, इसके प्रोटीन का जादू। रोज हरी सब्जी क्यों? इसकी आयरन की शक्ति से होगा गोल और मेडल भी। और पढ़ने में भी है ध्यान लगाना।
बच्चों का अधिकार है शिक्षा और
पौष्टिक आहार जो दे चुस्ती, खेलकूद और पढ़ाई के लिए।
पढ़ना पक्का।
मिड डे मील योजना का लाभ देश के 11 करोड़ से भी अधिक बच्चे पाते हैं।
Welcome back to a page from history. 25 years ago, Rajiv Gandhi visited China to initiate a new phase of relations between the two countries. Rajamohan, before we went in for the break, we were talking about the 1970s. At that point, you wanted to interject and say something. I'd like you to.
Look, I think there's something what you said about the non-Congress parties. Right. I think if you go back to the 1977 election, if you see the manifesto, that time the Jansan merged into the Janata Party. In fact, there's a strong critique of Indira Gandhi's foreign policy, where they say, look, she was too aggressive, she went too close to the Soviet Union, we want to be genuinely non-aligned, unlike she...
In pure black and white terms, it was generally being said that she's too pro-Soviet, so we have to become slightly pro-American.
No, that was not just the thing. I mean, that in terms of there was a much deeper argument about neighborhood, that the Congress party was hegemonic, was mucking around, have bad relations with all the neighbors, and that the non-Congress government would actually construct a good neighborly relationship.
Right.
So the US thing was relatively central, and then there were secret clauses in the India-Soviet agreement. Now, I think that the second part of the narrative of the non-Congress party is that the Congress party was responsible for the mess in the relationship with China, and that they were not legatees to that they didn't have to own the mess that Nehru and his daughter had created, and that they could make a fresh beginning. I mean, there was a belief, I mean, at least in people like Vajpayee, that look, we can look for a different way. And that's why you see even the BJP's manifesto in 96, I mean, where Jaswant comes from a very non-Congress tradition,
right,
and Brajesh Mishra, who was critical of India's policies, were willing to say, look, take a different approach to China. So I think there is something there in the non-Congress understanding of how to deal with China. I think in that sense, the 70s, Vajpayee also went to Pakistan. It was not just China. In fact, the whole, and he signed the first Ganges Waters Accord. Jagjeevan Ram was the one who signed it. So there was a whole approach at that point which said, look, we must have a different good neighborly relationship. And I think his visit was part of that, and that under the Indira Gandhi period, things got too jammed with our neighbors, so we got to deal with it differently. And I think that was part of the impulse that, but unfortunately for Vajpayee, the visit ended in a political
did not
crisis.
last too long. They could not continue the policy for a longer period of time.
And the more important thing, I think, if you look at the longer term, now with so many different governments, the question still is that as we look ahead, that can we construct a realist approach? That's something without being sentimental or without constructing China into some very unique special category. How do we produce that a realist basis for engaging China without sentimentalism?
Mr. Suri, let's try to look at what came out of the Rajiv Gandhi visit in the immediate context. We have been talking about that it did pave way for regular exchange of political visits at the highest levels. But besides that, the nuts and bolts operations, a joint working group coming up later on, some other panels or groups set up to assist the joint working group. Primarily not just only looking at the territorial dispute, but also looking at other strengthening trade ties, which really don't take off before the 21st century. But nonetheless, a lot of things seems to be happening after the Rajiv Gandhi visit. Somebody who was connected with the foreign service, has been there in India. How would you look at the immediate fallout of the Rajiv Gandhi visit?
I think the most important fallout of the Rajiv Gandhi visit was the subsequent agreements of 93 and 96 on peace and tranquility along the line of actual control, and confidence building measures along the line of actual control. I think the first few years after the 1988 visit were really used to make sure that the border becomes remains silent. It had been silent since then, since 1962 for all practical purposes, except for a couple of incidents in between, that this quiet border should become institutionally quiet. And so you have the means to do that. I think that was the most important fallout from my perspective of the Rajiv Gandhi visit, because you made sure then that you had now formal arrangements at the intergovernmental level to ensure that the border remains quiet along the line of actual control. So I must make that distinction. trade, etc., didn't really pick up. Yes, some people-to-people exchanges, some other exchanges began to take place, but the real growth in trade really took place in the 21st century.
Yes.
And that also, 21st century is an accurate way of putting it, I think, because if you look at 2000, trade was under $300 million.
Right.
And today we're standing at something like $70 billion.
Right.
But that, to my mind, was the most substantive part of the follow-up, and it has held us in very good stead. Because for all practical purposes, a shot had not been fired on the Sino-Indian border or along the line of actual control for more than 3 decades.
I wonder if Ambassador Suri might want to clarify on one of the controversies that, as Rajiv Gandhi came back from the visit, was the formulation on Tibet, that we seem to soften our historic position on Tibet. That, in terms of, since you covered it for so long, and what exactly was the change, and was it necessary? Well, I don't know what you thought about it.
No, I don't think. I think what we have been saying on Tibet has been misinterpreted by a lot of people for the wrong reasons. What they said in the communique of 88 and subsequently of 1991 was the old position. And if you look at the white papers, this comes out very clearly. Actually, in the white papers, India had categorically recognized Tibet as a part of China. In so many words, an official note was. So repeating it in 1988 and subsequently 1991 was, I think, part of a negotiating compromise. That we are going to talk about the border, but let's make sure that you agree that Tibet is part of China. So I don't see that as
change in India's position.
No, in fact, if you ask me, the change in India's position really came in June 2003, and that was a change for the better. But we can discuss that at a later phase, because if you look at the language of June 2003, it's very different from the language of 1988 or 1991.
Right. Alka Acharya, how do you look at the immediate gains out of Rajiv Gandhi's visit? We have talked about the joint working committee, joint working group, and we also talked about as to how a structural mechanism was put in place to ensure some kind of a structured peace and tranquility on the border. From your studies, from your the way you have tried to understand it, how do you look at what really came out of Rajiv Gandhi's visit?
It's very significant contribution to changing the logic of the Sino-Indian negotiations on the boundary dispute. You look at what was happening in the 60s and the nature of the dialogue between the two sides. It was very heavily legalistic. There was a lot of emphasis on historical evidence. Both sides were pulling out all sorts of documents and trying to do it. It was more of a historical-legalistic kind of an approach.
A lot of referencing to the 1914
exactly,
Simla
going back
and
into history, and it raised the question that how far back in history do you keep going? Then you come to Rajiv Gandhi's visit, which actually, and the greatest contribution as I see it is that it says, let us set the border dispute aside. It permitted space and scope for this relationship to actually start thinking of alternatives, more realistic, maybe more pragmatic ways in which you could expand the relationship. But on the other hand, as far as the boundary dispute was concerned, this visit becomes an interesting transition from the earlier historico-legal approaches to the current political settlement approach.
Became 2003 onwards the political at a political level.
You couldn't have moved from there to 2003. So Rajiv
away.
Gandhi therefore becomes a very necessary transition midway, because here you have the joint working groups which sought to bring in not just legal experts but scholars, cartographers, all sorts of experts were comprising and of course officials from both sides, and the attempt was to take a holistic view of it. So that I think becomes the second significant contribution, and the joint working group. Finally, and I really want to get back to this, that the 80s is a turning point in both India and China in terms of economic reforms and opening up to the West. China got its act far sooner. They were able to put into, but we had to wait till early 90s and then practically till the end of the 90s before our economic reforms start to really take off.
I think if you can at least say two problems that from that period, one achievements Alka has talked about. I think earlier Ambassador Suri pointed out, look, 71 meant India's primacy in the subcontinent. And the Chinese reaction to it was to provide nuclear weapons to Pakistan. So the process of actually assisting Pakistan to build nuclear weapons begins somewhere in the mid-70s, just as we were beginning to normalize. So by the time actually Rajiv Gandhi goes there in '88, Pakistan was already having a program. So I think in some senses they have created a mechanism to bottle you up in the region. And I think we're still struggling to come to terms with that one single fact. Today terrorism won't be what it is, but for the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons given by China. So therefore, while opening up to India, creating space for our bilateral relations, they also trumped us in a fundamental way, I think, in retrospect at least, within the subcontinent. The second thing I think that's happened for us in the China relationship, while China aligned with the US, began to, thanks to the Cold War alignment, they had open markets from the West, their economic growth picked up, while India's inability to get its act together meant the balance of power has steadily widened between China and India in China's favor. Probably in 1990, 88, 90, we were roughly equal in GDP per capita, whatever it is. But today they're 4 times larger. Their GDP, their defense spending is 4 times larger. But the fact is that what we've seen in the last 20 years, I mean, 2003 is an exception, but as the balance of power shifts in favor of China, they're becoming more and more difficult on the boundary issue. So the opportunities that we had, I mean, maybe at 80, 81, I wonder in retrospect, we would have been better off taking assuming there were those offers actually from the Chinese. Now it's going to get, I think, a lot more difficult to be able to get an agreement with them, I think.
Right. We'll take another break and then come back for the final segment. After Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, the one by Atal Bihari Vajpayee as Prime Minister in June 2003 was another turning point. This discussion will continue. Do not go away.
माँ, हाँ? आप कुछ भूल रही हो। क्या भूल रही हो? आपने नल नहीं बंद किया। उफ। अरे ध्रुव।
क्या दीदी?
तुम कुछ भूल गए।
क्या दीदी?
तुमने जाने से पहले लाइट नहीं ऑफ की।
उतना ही इस्तेमाल करें जितने की आवश्यकता है। आने वाली पीढ़ी को उनकी सुविधाओं से वंचित न करें।
जागो ग्राहक जागो।
क्या आपकी कार पार्किंग में सेफ है?
टेंशन लोगे तो दिमाग तो घूमेगा ही। थोड़ा सिंपल सोचो नेशनल इंश्योरेंस के मेडिक्लेम मोटर हाउस होल्डर्स और शॉपकीपर्स इंश्योरेंस के साथ। प्रॉम्प्ट सर्विस, हैसल फ्री प्रोसेस और फेयर सेटलमेंट्स। नेशनल इंश्योरेंस, थोड़ा सिंपल सोचो।
Raindrops are falling on my head, जैसे कोई प्यार की फुहार छुए मुझे बहती रहे। मौसम में है रवानी, जिंदगी बनी सुहानी।
बारिश का मजा तो सब लेते हैं, पर बारिश का पानी बचाने की बात कौन सोचता है। बारिश के पानी का संरक्षण करें और जिंदगी का यूं ही मजा लेते रहें।
मैं तो सारे मैसेज पढ़ूंगी। मैं नहीं देखती तुम्हारा मोबाइल।
तू कब आया मोनू?
अब तो मोनू के कॉलेज वापस जाने का टाइम आ गया है। जब भी कॉलेज जाने की बात करो, इसका चेहरा उतर जाता है। कुछ तो गड़बड़ है।
नहीं नहीं, नया नया स्टूडेंट है ना, तो सीनियर तो रैगिंग करते ही होंगे। चिंता वाली कोई बात नहीं।
चिंता की बात है भाई साहब। रैगिंग जैसे गंभीर मामले को नजरअंदाज मत कीजिए। एंटी रैगिंग हेल्पलाइन नंबर पे कॉल करें और उनसे सलाह और सहयोग लें।
एंटी रैगिंग हेल्पलाइन नंबर 1800-180-5522 पर कॉल करें।
कम नापतोल, आधी अधूरी सूचना, मिलावट। बाजार में निकले तो इनका ख्याल तो रखना ही पड़ता है। कहीं दूध में पानी की तो कहीं दाल में पत्थर की मिलावट, कहीं वजन में हेरा फेरी तो कहीं आपको अंधेरे में रखते छोटे छोटे शब्द। बहुत से लोग ऐसे ही व्यापार के ना जाने कितने ही अनुचित तरीकों को अपनाते हैं। उनसे बचिए, सावधान हो जाइए। कोई भी सामान पूरी जांच परख करने के बाद ही खरीदिए। अपने हक को जानो, जागो ग्राहक जागो।
Welcome back to a page from history. Rajiv Gandhi's discussions with Chinese leaders 25 years ago enhanced mutual confidence and understanding. Mr. Nalan Suri, before we went in for the break, Raja Mohan gave this view, that probably India, also got stumped by the Chinese in this entire process of normalizing ties, in the process of the Rajiv Gandhi visit and thereafter what came up, that probably things could have been handled slightly more differently. Of course, it's something which we can always say with the benefit of the hindsight. But somebody who was there in service at that particular time, how do you look at it, that could things have been handled slightly differently?
Well, let me just put it to you in a slightly different form. Perhaps one of the reasons why we began to normalize with China was also to make sure that their relationship with Pakistan gets diluted.
Right.
Now, it's true that, and I think I agree entirely with Raja, that while opening up to India, China made sure that India remains to some extent boxed in on the western side by their assistance to Pakistan. But the fact is, after our so-called peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, the presumption in the world was that you are nuclear capable. So if you are now helping India's enemy develop nuclear weapons, I think as far as the Chinese balance of power system and way of thinking is concerned, that was par for the course. See, our problem frequently is, and I'm going to say this very frankly and brutally, our problem is we always look at things from our perspective. We seldom look at things from another capital's perspective. And what impact do your actions have on them? This has been our biggest problem throughout, and it's the problem I find amongst our in the government, in the academic community, in the analyst community. We are so concerned about what we think that we forget that there are two parties to this whole business. We always look at how Delhi thinks. We never look at how Beijing reacts to what Delhi is doing, for instance. Right. So if a particular country is active in your neighborhood, it does not prevent you from being active in that country's neighborhood.
Right.
I mean, that is what you should normally expect as part of diplomatic interaction.
Should also anticipate what the other side is going to do.
Not just anticipate, try and see how they look at your actions and the impact of your actions.
It's also interesting that was the point at which this strategic triangle, which is the US, China, Soviet Union, was also beginning to interact in very interesting ways. So it was not just the Chinese who had started to use Pakistan against India. The Americans were taking equally very difficult kind of steps. Now, if you recall the period around Sundarung-Chu, which is the immediate backdrop to Rajiv Gandhi's visit, the Soviet position stunned India, frankly, because it apparently took a very neutral stand. They refused to take very obvious statements, make very pro-Indian statements. They tried to, take a very balanced kind of a stance. What do the Americans do? They come along and start the F-16 sale to Pakistan at that time, and I remember it created huge furor in India. That and the Chinese were also doing so. In a sense, I think Rajiv Gandhi's you can say that his attempt to bring India out of what were clearly very interesting dynamics between the superpowers on the one hand and China's changing relationship with the Soviet Union, he was obviously maneuvering for
There's quite a difference between what China did and what the US did.
Right.
US, of course, goes back to 1954. It had a treaty relationship with Pakistan. And post-Afghanistan Russian invasion, they did
They had
things.
to step in a great way.
The difference is that the Chinese gave nuclear weapons and missiles. That's a quality of military assistance which has been unique in the world, and for which we're paying price. I mean, if Pakistan had 1,000 F-16s, we can match it with what we're doing. But the character of the balance between India and Pakistan,
that fundamentally,
and there the Americans are to be blamed as well, because they kept quiet.
Right.
But they were not the party which was assisting Pakistan.
It was the Chinese who were doing it.
Yeah. And the second thing was, as Ambassador Suri said, look, I mean, we said peaceful nuclear explosion, and we believe our own, sorry, I don't want to use strong words, I mean, our own rhetoric. And now, rest of the world think, look, I mean, they're not fools. I mean, they think, look, if you've done an explosion, they think you're going to become a nuclear weapon power. So what the Chinese did was absolutely what a logical balance of power system would do. That you balance India by supporting China, by supporting Pakistan. But we were unwilling to see it. And that is the problem, that our inability to see what 71 and 74 meant for China.
Right.
And how the others, what they would do. That's been a big failure, but that of course is a deeper our failure. I mean, it's not just a problem in the bilateral relations. But I think 2003, I mean, I would want actually Ambassador Suri to speak a little bit on that, because I think there you see a non-Congress Prime Minister actually pushing for a boundary settlement, elevating the dialogue.
In fact, that is something we would like to all hear, because we are slowly beginning to head towards the concluding part of this discussion. 2003, 1988 to 2003, Alka Acharya said that had 1988 not happened, 2003 would not have happened. So, I would like to understand from you of 2003, its significance and where we have come so far.
This is a bit embarrassing because I handled the 2003 visit from headquarters.
Nothing embarrassing, you're not in service anymore, so you can definitely.
And subsequently went as ambassador to China, so it was a 6-year continuum. I think the 2003 visit was what I would call a major milestone. I will use an adjective for a change. No, simply because you had a qualitatively new situation now in the world, and you announced jointly certain parameters which would develop the relationship. This is also a time when I think India loomed larger on the world stage than it does today, perhaps.
Right.
For a variety of reasons. And I think the Chinese realized that this is a time when it would be useful to befriend India and see how far this could take them, so that they don't lose any flexibility that they may want to have in their relationships in the Asia Pacific region and in the world at large. I think Mr. Vajpayee during that visit really took forward what he would have liked to do in February 79 itself, which is to institutionalize a system by which a process could be started on the boundary to settle the boundary.
At a political level.
At a political level. And he found willing partners on the Chinese side. I would say that. I think the response from the Chinese was immediate, and the Asajj process was started. And the Asajj process has led to an agreement in April 2005 which defined the political parameters and the guiding principles for a border settlement. Now if you see those principles and parameters, you will find that the Chinese position has evolved considerably since the position that they had taken in the 50s and 60s on the principle that will be necessary or which should be used to settle the boundary. Now this is going to be a complicated and complex process, but more important than that, I think the real increase in the economic exchanges, and what I said at the very beginning, the process of deepening and diversifying the relationship really began with that visit.
Right.
I mean, you can look at all the parameters. You look at the dialogue mechanisms, you look at the trade, you look at the investments, you look at the interaction in other sectors, including, for instance, on water, etc., the defense mechanism. I mean, had 2003 visit not taken place, the first and most significant, I think, military agreement between India and China signed in May 2006 would never have happened.
Right.
So you have today a very significant interaction between the two countries. I mean, far in excess of what we could have actually imagined at the beginning of this century. There are obviously serious downsides. And I think for those downsides, everybody should read what the Prime Minister said at the party school during his visit in October this year. He's been very candid. And in fact, there is perhaps an element of regret in that statement of where we could have been and where we are in the relationship. So I rate that visit as a very significant one. So I think you need to not just look at Mr. Vajpayee's visit in June 2003, but you also need to look at Mr. Hu Jintao's visit in November 2006 and the subsequent visits. But these, I think, I would say that the 2003 visit, the April 2005 visit by Wen Xiaobao, and the November 2006 visit by Hu Jintao are the three most critical in the 21st century period. But I think the speech given by the Prime Minister at the party school during his visit in October this year should be read very carefully as our Prime Minister's view of how the relationship can be taken forward.
And also possibly also could have been, and we could have been in a slightly more better situation.
Yes, and well, that's right. There's a feeling, there's an element of tinge of regret in that speech of where we could have been but are not.
Right. Alkha-Acharya, listening to the three of you, it appears that 25 years after the 1988 visit of Rajiv Gandhi, we have completely been able to transform to a great extent the relations between India and China. There still are a lot of impediments in the public perception. Particularly, there are certain things which are particularly very glaring and which is cause for concern. Which intrusions in Arunachal Pradesh, it gets headlined in the newspapers. People who don't understand still look at the Chinese as these intrusions as nothing but probably an extension of 62, about which they understand very little. We have been talking about perceptions also of what happened in 62. So in the sum total, how do you look at the progress made, and what are the immediate challenges lying in front of the two countries, and also to try to bring about this basic change of public perception which we constantly are faced with?
No, I think there's no dispute about the fact that the Sino-Indian relationship has come a long, long way. From a one-point focused kind of a relationship, which was the boundary dispute. Today we have a marvelously diverse kind of relationship. My favorite graphic to illustrate this relationship is that of an inverted pyramid. You see, you have the largest scale of interactions going on at the top, which is government, more or less, officials, now business people are getting on. Then you come a bit lower down where you have scholars and academics who are increasingly engaging but are having to fight completely huge challenges in terms of the visa problems and exchange free. And then you come to the point, which is where the people-to-people kind of an exchange is. So what should really be the base of the relationship is actually the tip, you know. So the point really is, how do we now move into that phase where a greater exchange at the level of people happens? And I think we need to have a very frank, I mean, if we've been frank so far, I think we need to be even more frank about the kind of concerns that worry people here, which are very real. I mean, the perception is somewhere based on some kind of realities also. So I think we need to push that.
Can I just interrupt? You know, a very quick word of submission from Rajan. We're really running out of time.
Sure.
Just want to
I think the relationship is deeper today. There's more balance to it. But it's also facing new problems. And I think these problems are going to be much tougher than the ones we faced before. One, the border between India and China is a very different one now. The Chinese are operating, Chinese military is operating much closer to the border. They've improved the infrastructure on the other side, and that's put us in a very, very difficult situation. Second, the rising Chinese power is going to constricting our space in the subcontinent and in Asian stage. And that's going to be a real challenge for us. And lastly, I think the gap that has increased, the strategic gap between India and China today, as GDP 4 times larger, dealing with this must be the principal challenge for us, because there's no escaping.
There definitely are great challenges in front of the Indian political leadership. We are also into a year which is now being termed as the election year. So hopefully that by the time next year around this time, there would be greater clarity as to how to deal with this problem. Thank you very much for coming and joining in this program.
Also.
Yes. India and Chinese leaders have agreed to celebrate the next year as the 60th anniversary year of the Panchsheel Declaration. This development has been greatly possible because of Rajiv Gandhi's watershed visit 25 years ago. Though there is a debate on Panchsheel in its entirety, the fact of the leadership coming together to jointly celebrate this is a noteworthy event. I hope this program has enabled you to form a more coherent and balanced opinion of a complicated facet of Indian foreign policy. Please give us your feedback on this program. Our email ID is historylstv@gmail.com. We shall return next week. There will be another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I'm Amandra Bhatt. Today we discuss the situation in Bangladesh as protests against a January 5 election turned violent. Clashes erupted in Bangladesh on Sunday as the supporters of the opposition clashed with the police to protest against the election they were boycotting. The opposition says it will not take part in the vote unless it is overseen by an interim government and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina steps down. Meanwhile, on another level, following the execution of Jamaat Abdul Qadir Molla, there's been violence on the streets in Bangladesh. The cadres of the Jamaat have been on a rampage, destroying public property as well as killing the supporters of the Awami League. So whether Bangladesh, that is the question, and how the events in Bangladesh will impact our relationship with that neighbor, we discuss. And to discuss the crisis in Bangladesh, we are joined in our studios by three distinguished guests. Please welcome Dr. Smriti Patnaik. She's a research fellow with the IDSA. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Patnaik. Sitting next to her is Neelova Roy Chaudhary, senior journalist, editor, Symbiosis IRGA Mag. Welcome to Insight, Ms. Roy Chaudhary. And we're also joined by Mr. J.C. Sharma. He's a former secretary with the Ministry of External Affairs. He's also served the Indian Army for 5 years and fought in the 1971 Liberation War. Welcome to Insight, sir. Ms. Roy Chaudhary, I'd like to begin with you. Bangladesh seems to be going through a very confused period. There's violence and turmoil in the air. Is the chaos only related to the elections and the interim government and so on?
No. I personally feel that it is a basic sort of fight for survival of forces like the Jamaat Islami. Now, with the trials that have been taking place